December 8, 1941. Singapore. The radio crackled with news from Pearl Harbor as ordnance crews at Alexander Dockyard fit recoil pads to anti-tank rifles marked obsolete in European depots only months before. British commanders expected these weapons, the Boys Mark I anti-tank rifle, to gather dust in training schools, artifacts of a failed campaign in France. But intelligence summaries from Tokyo showed something different. Japanese Type 95 Hago light tanks carried armor just 12 to 13 millimeters thick. The same rifle that could not pierce a Panzer III's frontal plate could defeat Japanese armor at 300 yards. In waterlogged pits at Jitra, forward units would soon test this calculation. The weapon discarded in one theater would become the last practical anti-armor tool in another. This is the story of how a rifle written off as obsolete became the primary tank killer of the Pacific War. Enfield and Schuberines, 1937 through 1939. A proof plate, 16 millimeters thick, is hoisted onto the frame at the Royal Small Arms Factory testing range. Behind sandbags, a chronograph crew adjusts their instruments. The rifle about to be tested weighs 36 pounds fully loaded, measures 63.5 inches overall, and fires a cartridge designated .55 boys. The projectile, a steel-core armor-piercing round weighing 747 grains, will exit the barrel at approximately 747 meters per second, or 2,450 feet per second. The rifle bears the name of Captain H.C. Boys, the Royal Small Arms Factory officer who led the design team until his death in 1936. The weapon he helped create was Britain's answer to the light tanks proliferating across Europe in the late 1930s. These vehicles, French Renault 35s, German Panzer Is and IIs, Italian tankettes, typically carried armor between 10 and 16 millimeters thick. British specifications called for a man-portable weapon capable of defeating such protection at ranges up to 300 yards. The chronograph records flash. Velocity, 747 meters per second. The armor plate shows a clean perforation. At test ranges, the Boys Mark I demonstrates penetration of 21 to 23 millimeters of homogeneous steel plate at typical engagement distances. The Ordnance Board reviews the data and approves the design for production. Between 1937 and 1943, British factories will manufacture approximately 62,000 Boys anti-tank rifles in various marks. But even as the first production rifles leave Enfield, the strategic picture shifts. By 1939, newer German designs, the Panzer III with 30 millimeters of frontal armor, the Panzer IV with 50 millimeters, exceed the Boys rifle's penetration envelope. French Saumur and Charbie tanks carry even thicker protection. The weapon designed to counter 1930s light armor arrives in service just as European tank design moves beyond its capability. Field trials in 1939 reveal the problem. Test firings against captured or obsolete vehicles show the rifle effective against light reconnaissance tanks and armored cars. Against anything heavier, against the vehicles likely to dominate a European conflict, the Boys can achieve kills only with flank shots, engine compartment hits, or track disabling. Frontal engagements against modern medium tanks prove futile. The 747-grain projectile, traveling at 2,450 feet per second, simply lacks the energy to defeat 25 to 50 millimeters of face-hardened steel plate. Still, the rifle enters service. Infantry battalions receive issue scales of 1 to 3 rifles per company, organized into 2-man anti-tank teams. The gunner operates the weapon. A loader manages the 5-round detachable magazine and carries spare ammunition. Training emphasizes aimed fire, flank shots, and patience. British tactical doctrine in 1939 to 1940 assumes that these rifles, supplemented by towed 2-pounder anti-tank guns at battalion level, will provide adequate protection against armored assault. The assumption will not survive contact with reality. Improved ammunition arrives in 1940. A tungsten core variant raises muzzle velocity to approximately 884 meters per second, 2,900 feet per second, increasing penetration by roughly 15%. But even this enhancement cannot compensate for the rapid thickening of European tank armor. By May 1940, as German panzers rolled into France, the Boys rifle faced vehicles it could not reliably kill from the front. Yet the same technical specifications that doom the weapon in Europe, penetration of 21 to 23 millimeters, effective range of 300 yards, man-portable deployment, will make it ideal for a different theater. Intelligence reports from the Far East in 1940 and 1941 describe Japanese armored forces equipped primarily with light tanks. The Type 95 Hago with 12 to 14 millimeters of armor, the Type 97 Chiha with 15 to 25 millimeters of protection, and various armored cars with even thinner plate. Against these vehicles, the obsolete boy's rifle becomes suddenly, unexpectedly adequate. The question is whether enough rifles and enough ammunition will reach the Far East before war begins. France and Britain, May through June 1940. The British Expeditionary Force deploys to France with full-issue scales of boys' rifles, 1,200 weapons distributed across infantry battalions. Forward anti-tank sections establish positions along the Belgian border, covering likely approach routes for German armor. The rifles wait, bipods dug into French soil, muzzles aligned on road junctions and bridges. The German offensive began on May 10, 1940. Within days, reports filter back to British headquarters. The boys' rifles are engaging targets, Panzer IIs, Panzer IIIs, occasional Panzer IVs. The results are mixed at best. Flank shots at close range, under 100 yards, sometimes achieve penetrations. Frontal engagements prove almost universally futile. A 747-grain projectile striking 30 millimeters of face-hardened steel at oblique angles simply ricochets or fragments. Tank crews report the impacts. Sharp clangs against their armor, but suffer no serious damage. By contrast, German 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns and British 2-pounder guns at battalion level prove far more effective. The disparity becomes obvious in combat. Infantry sections armed only with boys' rifles find themselves effectively helpless against medium tanks. Casualties mount. Rifles are abandoned as units retreat. Others are destroyed to prevent capture. Of the approximately 1,200 boys' rifles deployed to France with the BEF, fewer than half returned to Britain after Dunkirk. A return-to-store ledger at a British Ordnance Depot, June 1940, lists 587 boys' rifles recovered from Dunkirk. Many show damage, bent barrels, broken bipods, shattered stocks. Repair priorities favor weapons with demonstrated combat utility. The boys' rifle, having failed its first major test, drops on the list. Serviceable rifles move to home forces units and training establishments. The weapon becomes a stopgap, something to issue to newly formed battalions until better equipment arrives. British War Office summaries from summer 1940 describe the boys as insufficient against increased armor thickness. Issue scales for units defending against potential German invasion are maintained, but enthusiasm wanes. Commanders prioritize acquisition of towed anti-tank guns, 2-pounders, and later 6-pounders and 17-pounders. The infantry anti-tank rifle as a concept loses credibility. Yet this strategic downgrading creates an unexpected benefit. As home forces units re-equip with better weapons, surplus boys' rifles accumulate in depots. These weapons and their ammunition stocks become available for overseas dispatch. The Middle East receives some shipments. India and Burma Command request allocations. Far East Command in Singapore began filing requisitions for additional anti-tank rifles in late 1940 and early 1941. The requests cite intelligence on Japanese armor. British assessments note that Japanese tanks in China and Manchuria carry light protection, rarely exceeding 20 millimeters. If war comes to Southeast Asia, the intelligence summaries suggest platoon-level anti-tank weapons effective against 12 to 20 millimeter armor will have value. The boys' rifle written off in Europe might retain utility in the Pacific. Singapore's ordnance depots receive shipments through 1941. By December, Malaya Command held stock sufficient to issue boys' rifles to battalion anti-tank sections at scales exceeding European norms. Some units receive 4 to 6 rifles per battalion, double the typical European allocation. Ammunition stocks, 55 boys' cartridges in 5-round chargers, accumulate at forward supply dumps. Hong Kong garrison receives similar allocations. The island's defense plan, drafted in 1941, assumes Japanese assault will include light armor, tankettes and armored cars crossing from the mainland. Boys' rifles are positioned to cover likely crossing points and road approaches. Training emphasizes close-range ambush, allow the vehicle to close to within 100 yards, aim for side armor or engine compartments, fire rapidly and displace. Burma Command receives smaller allocations, but enough to equip forward battalions. Indian Army units deploying to Burma in late 1941 include anti-tank sections armed with boys' rifles as their primary, often only anti-armor weapon. The rifles are old technology, surplus from a failed campaign, but they are available and they might work. The Imperial Japanese Army, planning operations against Malaya, Hong Kong, and Burma in autumn 1941, makes its own assessments. Japanese intelligence estimates British anti-tank capability at platoon level as minimal. They expect primarily small arms, rifles, light machine guns, grenades. Towed anti-tank guns will be present at battalion or brigade level, but not forward in the infantry sections. This assessment shapes tactical planning. Japanese doctrine calls for rapid infiltration, using light tanks and infantry in close coordination to penetrate British positions before heavy weapons can respond. The assessment is partially correct. British platoons lack dedicated anti-tank guns. But the assessment misses the boys' rifles, dozens of them, forward with the infantry, waiting in ambush positions along the Malayan roads. On December 8, 1941, two things happen simultaneously. Japanese forces cross into Malaya and attack Hong Kong. And the weapon dismissed as obsolete in France finds itself facing the enemy it was actually designed to kill. Singapore and Hong Kong, November through December 1941. At Alexander Dockyard's Ordnance Workshop, an armorer inspects a boy's rifle fresh from depot storage. The weapon shows minor corrosion, surface rust on the barrel, oxidation on the bipod joints. He disassembles the bolt, cleans the mechanism with solvent, and applies fresh oil to bearing surfaces. The barrel receives a pull-through with cloth patches until they emerge clean. The recoil pad, a thick rubber buffer designed to absorb the weapon's notorious kick, gets checked for cracking. Satisfied, he stamps the rifle's service record and passes it to the next workbench for final inspection. This process repeats hundreds of times across Far East Command in the weeks before war. Every boy's rifle in theater undergoes inspection, cleaning, and function testing. Ammunition stocks are verified. Spare parts, firing pins, magazine springs, bipod assemblies are distributed to battalion armorers. The weapon that British commanders in Europe considered obsolete receives renewed attention in Southeast Asia. Training intensifies. At Kluang Camp in central Malaya, infantry sections practice anti-tank drills with their newly issued boys' rifles. The instructors emphasize fundamentals: stable position, proper sight picture, breath control. They stress the weapon's limitations. Maximum effective range against armor, 300 yards, realistically closer to 200. Penetration capability, adequate against light armor, 12 to 16 millimeters, questionable against anything heavier. Best targets: side armor, engine compartments, tracks, vision slits. The training scenarios simulate expected threats. Intelligence briefs describe the Type 95 Hago as the likely primary opponent. A light tank weighing 7.4 tons, carrying 12 mm armor on the hull front, 12 to 14 mm on the sides, 6 mm on top and rear. The turret adds minimal additional protection. The vehicle mounts a 37 mm main gun and two 7.7 mm machine guns. Crew 3. Typical speed on roads, 28 miles per hour. Off-road, slower, but still mobile in firm terrain. British calculations suggest the boy's rifle can defeat Hago armor at ranges up to 300 yards with well-aimed shots. Flank shots are preferred, but even frontal shots might penetrate the 12 mm hull plate if fired from a stable position with good ammunition. The math checks out. A 747-grain steel core projectile at 747 meters per second delivers sufficient kinetic energy to perforate 12 millimeters of mild steel plate at 300 yards. Face-hardened armor complicates the calculation, but Japanese light tanks in the late 1930s are not believed to use extensive hardening. At Hong Kong, similar preparations proceed. The garrison's defense plan positions boys' rifles to cover the three main approach routes from the mainland Sham Shui Po, Kowloon docks, and the eastern beaches. Each rifle receives a designated field of fire, typically a road or track where armor might advance. The gunners dig shallow pits, camouflage their positions, and pre-range landmarks using the rifle's aperture sights. The British expect Japanese armor to appear within days of any attack on the new territories. Malaya Command's disposition in early December 1941 places significant boys' rifle strength forward. The 11th Indian Division, responsible for defending northern Malaya, deploys battalions with 4 to 6 boys' rifles each. The 2nd 15th Punjab Regiment, 2nd 1st Gurkha Rifles, and 1st 14th Punjab Regiment all carry full allocations. These rifles are positioned to cover the main north-south road, the route Japanese armor must use to advance down the peninsula toward Singapore. General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 25th Army, preparing to invade Malaya, includes substantial armored strength by Japanese standards. The 5th Division brings elements of the 1st Tank Regiment, Type 95 Hagos organized in company strength. The 18th Division and Imperial Guards Division include additional light tanks and armored cars. Total Japanese armor in the initial invasion, approximately 80 to 100 light tanks, plus assorted armored cars and tankettes. This represents a significant mechanized force for jungle warfare in 1941. Japanese planning assumes these tanks will provide shock action and mobility, overwhelming British defensive positions before heavy weapons can deploy. The light armor is considered adequate for the mission. Japanese doctrine prioritizes speed and infiltration over heavy protection. The Hago's 12mm armor will stop rifle-caliber bullets and shell fragments, which is all the designers believe necessary for Pacific operations. Neither side fully appreciates what will happen when a 747-grain armor-piercing projectile, traveling at 2,450 feet per second, strikes 12 millimeters of mild steel plate at 200 yards. The test will come at Jitra in the first hours of the Pacific War. Jitra, Malaya, December 11th through 13th, 1941. Forward positions of the 2nd 15th Punjab Regiment occupy shallow trenches in waterlogged paddy fields. Monsoon rains have turned the defensive line into a series of mud-filled pits connected by flooded communication trenches. In several positions, boys' rifle teams dig their bipods into earthen berms, arranging ammunition and adjusting their fields of fire to cover the approach roads. The Japanese attack begins before dawn on December 12th. Artillery preparation, brief but intense, targets known British positions. Then silence. In the pre-dawn darkness, infantry movement, rustling, splashing, the occasional metallic clink of equipment. The British defenders wait, fingers on triggers, eyes straining to identify targets in the gloom. First light brings the tanks. Type 95 Hagos, advancing in section strength, 3 to 4 vehicles, moving cautiously along the road. The lead tank, buttoned up against expected small arms fire, navigates around shell craters and debris. The crew inside hears only the engine's roar and the squeak of road wheels. They anticipate harassment, rifle fire, maybe a few grenades, but nothing that can seriously threaten 7.4 tons of steel. The first boy's rifle opens fire at approximately 150 yards. The gunner, a Punjab Regiment Lance Corporal whose name is not recorded in available sources, has a stable position and a clear flank shot. The rifles report. A massive crack, louder than any standard infantry weapon, echoes across the paddy. The recoil slams into his shoulder despite the pad. The bullet, 747 grains of steel core projectile moving at 747 meters per second, strikes Hago's side armor 12 millimeters thick. Perforation. The projectile punches through the armor plate, tumbles inside the crew compartment, and ricochets off internal fittings. The effect inside the tank is catastrophic. The crew commander dies instantly. The driver and gunner bail out, wounded and disoriented. The tank, engine still running, coasts to a halt 30 yards further down the road. A second rifle fires, targeting another Hago. This shot strikes at a slightly oblique angle, not perfect but adequate. Another perforation. This crew also abandons their vehicle, one man dragging a wounded comrade. The third tank in the section, seeing two vehicles disabled in as many minutes, reverses rapidly and withdraws behind a tree line. This scene repeats along the Jitra line. Japanese armor, advancing to exploit gaps in the British position, encounters rifle-caliber anti-tank fire that actually works. Not every shot achieves a kill. Many rounds ricochet, particularly on frontal impacts. But enough shots penetrate to disrupt the attack. Over 2 days of fighting at Jitra, British records credit boys' rifles with disabling or destroying multiple Hagos. Exact counts are difficult: battlefield chaos, inadequate record-keeping, overlapping claims, but post-battle assessment confirms at least 4 to 6 confirmed kills attributed to boys' rifle fire. The Japanese reaction is shock. Tank crews report rifle-caliber weapons perforating their armor, something doctrine insisted was impossible. After-action reports describe British anti-tank rifles as unexpectedly effective. Japanese intelligence begins revising its assessments of British platoon-level anti-armor capability. For British defenders, the Jitra engagement provides a morale boost amid what is otherwise a disastrous battle. The overall tactical situation, Japanese infiltration, flanking attacks, poor defensive preparation, forces a British withdrawal. But the infantry sections with boys' rifles gain confidence. The weapon works. Against the expected threat, it performs exactly as the original 1937 specifications promised. The contrast with France is stark. In Europe, boys' rifles bounced rounds off panzer armor and achieved little. In Malaya, the same weapon, same caliber, same projectile weight, same muzzle velocity kills tanks. The difference is the target. Japanese light tanks, designed for speed and mobility rather than heavy protection, present exactly the threat profile the boys' rifle was engineered to defeat. As British forces retreat south from Jitra, they take their boys' rifles with them. Ammunition resupply becomes a priority. Ordnance convoys moving south from Singapore include 55 boys' cartridges alongside regular small arms ammunition. The rifle, written off as obsolete 18 months earlier, is now recognized as the only practical platoon-level anti-tank weapon available to British forces in Malaya. The war is 3 days old. The boys' rifle has already proven more effective in the Pacific than in 18 months of European service. Malaya, January 1942. A movement table at Singapore's railway supply depot lists consignments moving north to retreating units. Among standard infantry supplies, rifle ammunition, grenades, rations, multiple entries specify 55 boys' cartridges. 5-round magazines, packaged in wooden crates, move by rail and truck to forward dumps. The logistical priority reflects tactical reality. As British and Indian battalions conduct fighting withdrawal down the peninsula, their boys' rifles remain actively engaged. The retreat from Jitra to Singapore covers approximately 450 miles. British forces establish successive defensive lines, the Perak River, Kampar, Slim River, Muar, attempting to delay the Japanese advance long enough for reinforcements to reach Singapore. Each position sees boys' rifles in action. At Kampar, January 9th through 11th, the 2nd Gurkha Rifles and 2nd 9th Gurkha Rifles defended a strong position on high ground. Japanese armor attempts to force the roadblock. Boys' rifle teams, positioned in ambush, engage at ranges of 100 to 200 yards. Multiple Hagos take hits. Some are destroyed outright, penetrations through crew compartments causing casualties and fires. Others suffer mobility kills, shots through engine compartments or tracks. Japanese tank companies report significant losses to British anti-tank fire, though they cannot always distinguish between rifle fire and heavier weapons. The Slim River Battle, January 7th, sees boys' rifles employed in a more desperate context. Japanese breakthrough catches British forces during withdrawal movement. Infantry sections, separated from their parent units, establish hasty defensive positions. Boys' rifles engage Japanese armor at point-blank range, 50 to 100 yards, as tanks overrun rear area positions. The close-range engagements favor the rifles. At 50 yards, even marginal shot placement achieves perforations. Several Hagos are destroyed or abandoned. But the overall tactical situation, Japanese penetration, British command breakdown, results in disaster. The rifle's effectiveness cannot compensate for operational failure. Throughout the campaign, ammunition supply remains adequate. Singapore's ordnance facilities maintain stocks sufficient to support ongoing operations. Resupply convoys reach forward units between engagements. The 55 Boys cartridge, produced in British factories through 1940 and 1941, is not yet in short supply. Rifle maintenance presents more challenges. The Boys is mechanically complex, prone to stoppages if not properly maintained. In tropical conditions, heat, humidity, mud, rifles require daily cleaning. Armorers at battalion level work to keep weapons serviceable, replacing broken parts, adjusting sights, ensuring reliable function. British after-action reports from Malaya consistently note the Boys rifle's utility. A January 1942 summary from 11th Indian Division describes the weapon as effective against light tanks and armored cars at ranges up to 200 yards. Recommended tactics include ambush from flank positions, aimed fire at vulnerable points, sides, rear, engine compartments, and immediate displacement after firing to avoid counterfire. The report acknowledges the weapon's limitations, insufficient against heavier armor, difficult to conceal due to size and weight, but concludes that it remains valuable in the theater. Japanese sources provide confirmation from the enemy perspective. Captured documents and post-war interrogations describe Hago Crew's fear of British anti-tank rifles. Tank commanders adjust tactics, avoiding obvious ambush positions, using infantry to clear suspected rifle locations before committing armor. Some units add improvised protection, sandbags, spare track links, though weight constraints limit effectiveness. The 7.4-ton Hago, designed for mobility, cannot accept significant armor increases without sacrificing speed and mechanical reliability. As British forces fall back towards Singapore, the strategic picture darkens. Reinforcements arrive, but too few and too late. Japanese air superiority disrupts movement and resupply. The defensive perimeter shrinks. Yet the infantry sections maintain their Boys rifles, and ammunition continues to flow forward. The weapon that failed in France remains in action, still killing tanks, still providing the only anti-armor capability at platoon level. By late January, British forces contracted into Singapore's inner defenses. Boys rifles take position covering causeways and approach roads. The weapons that traveled from England to Singapore via depot storage now wait in final defensive positions. Gunners, many now veterans of multiple engagements, adjust their sights and check their ammunition. They know the rifle works. They have seen it perforate Japanese armor. Whether it will be enough to hold Singapore is another question. The answer will be no. But the rifle's effectiveness is not in doubt. Burma and India, 1942 through 1943. At a Rangoon Ordnance Depot in late 1941, a supply officer reviews incoming manifests. Among the equipment recently arrived from India, 23 Boys anti-tank rifles, marked for issue to forward battalions. The officer makes the necessary entries, assigns the weapons to depot storage, and waits for allocation orders from Burma Army Headquarters. The allocation orders come quickly. Burma Corps, assembling to defend against expected Japanese invasion, requests anti-tank rifles for infantry battalions. The depot releases the Boys rifles with associated ammunition, 5-round magazines, cleaning kits, spare parts. The weapons moved forward to battalions of the 1st Burma Division and 17th Indian Division. Japanese invasion of Burma begins January 20, 1942. Initial engagements mirror the Malayan pattern. Japanese armor, primarily Type 95 Hagos with some Type 97 Chihas, advances in support of infantry operations. British and Indian defenders employ Boys rifles in ambush. The results are consistent. Flank shots at close range penetrate light armor. Disabled and destroyed tanks accumulate as the campaign progresses. The Burma campaign differs from Malaya in terrain. Where Malaya offered roads through rubber plantations and open ground, Burma presents jungle, rivers, and limited road networks. Mechanized operations concentrate on the few available routes. This channelization favors anti-tank ambushes. Boys rifle teams can predict likely approach routes, prepare positions, and engage at optimum range. At the Sittang Bridge Battle, February 22nd through 23rd, boys' rifles were among the weapons covering the British withdrawal. Japanese armor attempts to force the crossing before British engineers demolish the bridge. Anti-tank fire, including multiple boys' rifles, engages approaching tanks. Several Hagos are disabled. The bridge is eventually blown with British forces still on the wrong side. A tactical disaster, but the boys' rifles perform as expected during the engagement. British withdrawal from Burma continues through spring 1942. By May, surviving forces reach India. Among the equipment carried back, serviceable boys' rifles. These weapons, and others from Indian Army stocks, form the anti-tank capability of the 14th Army as it reconstitutes in northeast India. The 14th Army in 1942 and 1943 faced limited Japanese armor. The terrain, Arakan Hills, Chin Mountains, Assam jungles, is unsuitable for large-scale mechanized operations. Japanese employ light tanks in packets, supporting infantry where roads permit. This tactical context sustains the boys' rifle's relevance. The weapon is adequate against the threat actually present. Indian ordnance facilities support ongoing operations. Repair depots at Calcutta and Secunderabad overhaul returned boys' rifles, replacing worn parts, rebarreling weapons with excessive throat erosion, updating stocks. Ammunition production continues. The 55 boys cartridge is manufactured at Indian facilities throughout 1942 and 1943, ensuring adequate supply for combat operations. Improved ammunition appears in theaters. A tungsten core variant, developed in Britain in 1940, offers higher muzzle velocity, 884 meters per second versus 747, and better penetration. Field tests in India confirm approximately 15 to 20% improvement in armor penetration at standard ranges. Against Type 95 armor, 12 to 14 millimeters, the improvement is marginal but welcome. The enhanced rounds increase confidence in frontal engagements, though flank shots remain preferred. 14th Army Tactical Summaries from 1943 rate the boys' rifle as effective against light armor. An intelligence assessment dated July 1943 notes that Japanese forces in Burma continue to employ Type 95 and Type 97 tanks in limited numbers. The assessment recommends maintaining boys' rifle issue scales and ensuring adequate ammunition stocks. The weapon is not ideal. Commanders would prefer more powerful anti-tank guns, but it works, it's available, and it matches the threat. As 14th Army prepares for counteroffensive operations in late 1943, boys' rifles remain in the inventory. Planning for operations in Arakan assumes continued availability of these weapons at platoon level. The rifle that Britain tried to retire after France had found a permanent home in Southeast Asia Command. The question facing British planners is how long the weapon will remain effective. Japanese armor design is evolving. Newer models reportedly carry thicker protection. If the Pacific War continues into 1944 and beyond, will the boys' rifle remain adequate? Or will it finally become truly obsolete? New Guinea and the Solomons, 1942 through 1944. An Australian patrol of the 2nd 6th Battalion prepares for movement along a jungle track in the Owen Stanley Range. Among their equipment, a boys' anti-tank rifle mounted on a makeshift tripod. The weapon's intended role, destroying enemy armor, does not match the tactical situation. Japanese forces in New Guinea deploy minimal armor, but the Australians have discovered alternative uses. The patrol encounters a Japanese supply truck moving along a coastal track. The boys' rifle, positioned in ambush, fires a single shot. The 747-grain projectile perforates the truck's engine block, destroying the vehicle and blocking the track. The patrol withdraws before Japanese infantry can react. Mission accomplished, enemy logistics disrupted, using an anti-tank rifle as a long-range precision weapon. This tactical improvisation characterizes Australian employment of the boys' rifle throughout the Pacific Campaign. Issued as anti-armor weapons, the rifles become multi-role heavy rifles, engaging bunkers, barges, supply vehicles, and occasional light armor when present. Australian Army inventiveness, combined with the weapon's raw power, creates applications beyond the original design intent. The 2nd 9th Battalion experiments with specialized ammunition. Standard armor-piercing loads work for most targets, but soldiers request incendiary rounds for use against fuel dumps and wooden structures. Australian Army Inventions Directorate responds with field-expedient incendiary projectiles, modified AP rounds with phosphorus tips. Testing confirms ignition on impact with sufficient energy transfer. The modification never enters formal production, but limited quantities circulate among forward units. Australian War Memorial Holdings document these adaptations. A 1943 report describes boys' rifles used against Japanese barges attempting river crossings. The heavy rifle, firing from prepared positions on riverbanks, can disable or sink lightly constructed landing craft at ranges exceeding 400 yards. The penetration is excessive for the target, 55 caliber through thin plywood, but the result is effective. Several barges are sunk during operations along the Sepik River. Anti-bunker use becomes common. Japanese defensive positions in New Guinea often include reinforced bunkers, logs, earth, sometimes concrete. Standard infantry weapons, rifles, machine guns, struggle to penetrate. The boy's rifle, with its steel core projectile and high velocity, can defeat multiple layers of logs at ranges where other weapons are ineffective. Australian infantry sections use the rifles for precision bunker suppression, carefully aimed shots through firing slits or weak points in construction. The rifle's weight, 36 pounds, presents challenges in jungle terrain. Carrying the weapon through New Guinea's mountains requires 2 soldiers and reduces patrol mobility. But the capability justifies the burden. When heavier weapons are unavailable, mortars stuck in mud, artillery out of range, the boy's rifle provides organic heavy firepower at platoon level. Australian Ordnance maintains adequate ammunition stocks throughout the campaign. The 55 boys cartridge ships from Australian and British sources, arriving via Port Moresby and other supply bases. Resupply reaches forward units intermittently. Jungle logistics are difficult but never completely fails. Rifle maintenance follows standard procedures, with battalion armorers handling repairs and local ordnance facilities supporting overhaul. Type 94 Japanese trucks remain a primary target. These light cargo vehicles, essential to Japanese logistics, are vulnerable to boys' rifle fire. A single well-placed shot through the engine immobilizes the vehicle permanently. Australian doctrine emphasizes this anti-vehicular role, denying Japanese mobility and supply, as equal in value to the rifle's anti-armor capability. When Japanese armor does appear, Type 95 Hagos or Type 97 Chi has supporting infantry attacks. Australian boys' rifles engage according to standard doctrine. Flank shots, close range, aimed at vulnerable points. The results mirror British experience in Malaya and Burma. Perforations, crew casualties, disabled vehicles. But these engagements are rare. Japanese armor in New Guinea and the Solomons is scarce. The arrival of PIAT anti-tank weapons in late 1943 provides an alternative. The projector infantry anti-tank offers greater penetration and does not require aimed precision. It's a close-range area weapon, lobbing hollow charge bombs. Some Australian units began replacing boys' rifles with PIATs, but others retain both weapons, finding that the rifle's range and accuracy complement the PIAT's close-range power. By 1944, Australian formations in the Pacific included boys' rifles in mixed anti-tank sections. A typical section might have 1 or 2 boys' rifles and 1 PIAT, providing capability across different engagement scenarios. The rifle designed in Britain in the 1930s, written off after France, remains in Australian service as a specialized precision weapon. The tactical innovation demonstrates something important. When soldiers have access to capable tools, they find uses beyond the original design specification. The boy's rifle, freed from its narrow anti-tank role, becomes a long-range heavy rifle filling gaps in Australian infantry firepower. It is a pattern that will continue through 1945. Tokyo, 1942 through 1943. At an Army Technical Bureau facility, a captured boy's anti-tank rifle lies on an examination bench beside measuring instruments and armor plate samples. The rifle arrived from Malaya in spring 1942, recovered from a British position overrun during the Singapore campaign. Japanese engineers received orders to evaluate the weapon that killed so many Hagos. The examination begins with basic measurements. Overall length, 63.5 inches. Weight, 36 pounds unloaded. Barrel length, 36 inches. Caliber, .55 inches, 14 millimeters in metric terms. The engineers note the weapon size, substantially larger than standard infantry rifles, and its complexity. The bolt mechanism, recoil system, and magazine feed all receive detailed documentation. Ammunition examination follows. A 747-grain projectile, steel core with mild steel jacket, loaded to generate approximately 747 meters per second muzzle velocity. The engineers calculate kinetic energy, approximately 17,000 joules. They compare this to Japanese anti-tank rifles under development, the Type 97 20mm, and find the British weapon delivers less energy. Yet combat reports indicate the boys achieves reliable perforations of Hago armor. This discrepancy drives ballistic testing. The engineers set up armor plate samples, 12 mm, 15 mm, 20 mm, matching typical Japanese tank specifications. They fire the captured rifle, carefully measuring impact velocity and penetration. The results confirm combat reports. At 200 meters, the boy's projectile perforates 12 mm plates consistently. At 300 meters, penetration remains probable. Only at ranges exceeding 350 meters does the armor reliably defeat the projectile. Japanese tank designers review the data with concern. The Type 95 Hago, in service since 1935, carries 12 mm hull armor and 12 to 14 mm on the turret. The Type 97 Chiha offers marginally better protection, 15 to 25 mm, but most variants cluster at the lower end of this range. Both vehicles are comprehensively vulnerable to boys' rifle fire at typical jungle combat ranges. Design studies explore countermeasures. Adding armor is the obvious solution, but weight constraints limit options. The Hago's 7.4-ton design weight assumes a light, mobile vehicle. Increasing protection to 25 or 30 millimeters, sufficient to reliably defeat the boy's rifle, would add approximately 1 to 1.5 tons. This weight increase threatens engine performance, suspension durability, and ground pressure. The result would be a slower, mechanically stressed vehicle unsuitable for rapid exploitation. Alternative approaches include spaced armor, external plates mounted several inches from the main armor, causing projectiles to tumble before impacting the primary surface. Field tests confirm this reduces penetration effectiveness, but implementation challenges are severe. Adding spaced armor to existing Hagos in field conditions exceeds available maintenance capacity. Factory modifications are possible but require production line changes during wartime. Sandbag armor becomes a practical compromise. Tank crews begin adding sandbags to vulnerable areas, sides, rear engine compartments, creating improvised spaced protection. The addition helps somewhat against oblique impacts but adds weight and bulk. Many crews adopt partial sandbagging, protecting the most vulnerable zones, accepting continued risk elsewhere. Japanese tank doctrine adjusts in response. New tactical guidance emphasizes infantry armor coordination, using infantry to suppress anti-tank weapons before committing tanks. Reconnaissance protocols stress identifying British anti-tank positions prior to main attacks. Tank crews receive training in evasive maneuvering and rapid displacement after contact. The goal is reducing exposure to aimed rifle fire. But the fundamental vulnerability remains. Japanese light tanks in 1942 and 1943 cannot be economically up-armored to defeat 14mm armor-piercing projectiles. The industrial base, material constraints, and strategic priorities prevent comprehensive redesign. The Imperial Army accepts that its tanks will face rifle-caliber anti-tank threats they cannot fully defeat. This acceptance has consequences. As the war continues, Japanese armor becomes increasingly cautious. Tank infantry coordination improves, but mechanized exploitation, the original doctrinal purpose of light tanks, becomes riskier. Commanders husband scarce armor assets, deploying them only when infantry has secured approaches and suppressed anti-tank weapons. The aggressive tank employment that characterized early Pacific campaigns gives way to conservative tactics in 1943 and beyond. The boy's rifle, a weapon Britain tried to discard, has forced doctrinal change on its opponent. The Imperial Japanese Army cannot engineer the rifle's effectiveness away. They must instead adapt tactics to minimize exposure. It is a victory for the obsolete weapon, and a lesson in how context determines capability. A rifle inadequate in Europe is more than adequate in the Pacific. The difference is the enemy's armor, not the rifle's power. Arakan, Burma, February 1944. A defensive box on the Ngekidok Pass Road, nicknamed the Admin Box by British forces, holds critical supplies and medical facilities for the 15th Corps. Japanese forces, executing Operation Hago, surround the position, cutting supply lines. The garrison's orders: hold until relief arrives. Among defensive weapons, boys' anti-tank rifles positioned to cover approach tracks. February 5th through 23rd, 1944. Japanese attacks test the perimeter repeatedly. Infantry probes escalate to coordinated assaults supported by light armor. Type 95 Hagos, operating in small groups, attempt to penetrate the defensive wire and reach supply dumps. Each attempt encounters boys' rifle fire. A company war diary from the 2nd West Yorkshire Regiment records the engagements. February 7th. 1 Hago disabled by boys' rifle fire. Range approximately 150 yards. Flank shot. Crew abandoned vehicle. February 9th. 2 Hagos engaged. 1 destroyed. 1 withdrew with visible damage. February 12th. Japanese armor approaches from northeast. Boys' team fires 6 rounds. Claims 1 penetration. Tank retreats. The accumulation of these small actions, individual two-man teams firing a few rounds per engagement, creates cumulative effect. Japanese armor cannot achieve tactical surprise. Every approach must anticipate anti-tank rifle fire. Tank commanders button up, reducing visibility. Crews maneuver defensively, limiting exposure time. The psychological impact matches the material damage. Hago crews know their armor is vulnerable and adjust behavior accordingly. Ammunition resupply becomes critical. The admin box holds limited stocks of 55 boys ammunition, approximately 200 rounds total among multiple rifles. Resupply by airdrop is difficult. The cartridges are heavy and require careful packing to prevent damage. But RAF transport aircraft manage several successful drops, including 1 delivery of 120 boys rounds on February 14th. The ammunition arrives just as forward rifles report depletion to final magazines. British relief forces break through on February 23rd. The admin box garrison, having held for 18 days under siege, survives with stocks nearly exhausted. Among the empty ammunition crates, multiple boxes marked .55 boys. The rifle contributed to the defensive success. Not decisively, not dramatically, but consistently, engagement after engagement. Post-battle assessment tallies Japanese losses. Multiple Hagos destroyed or abandoned, though exact attribution to boys' rifles versus other weapons is impossible. The tanks faced a combined defense: boys' rifles, 2-pounder guns, Piats, mines, artillery. But infantry reports consistently credit the boys with multiple kills. The obsolete rifle, in its 3rd year of Pacific service, remains effective. 14th Army's broader counteroffensive in Arakan and central Burma through spring and summer 1944 employs boys' rifles throughout. As British and Indian forces advance, anti-tank rifle teams move forward with infantry sections. Engagements with Japanese armor continue the established pattern: ambush, close-range fire, flank shots, disabled vehicles. The rifle's limitations become more apparent in 1944. The Japanese deploy more Chiha medium tanks, 15 to 25 millimeters of frontal armor, which resist boys' fire at typical engagement ranges. Only flank or rear shots remain reliably effective. British forces increasingly rely on heavier weapons, 6-pounder and 17-pounder anti-tank guns, Piats, for anti-armor work. The boys' rifle transitions toward supplementary status. But supplementary does not mean useless. Infantry sections retain the rifles because they provide capability that heavier weapons do not. A 6-pounder gun requires a towing vehicle, dedicated crew, and prepared position. A boy's rifle deploys with 2 men and operates from any location offering stable support. For immediate action anti-armor at platoon level, the rifle remains valuable. Ammunition logistics support continued employment. British ordnance facilities in India maintain production of 55 Boys cartridges through 1944. Supply convoys include the ammunition alongside standard loads. The rifle may be obsolete by European standards, but Southeast Asia Command keeps it in service. As 1944 progresses, the tactical picture evolves. Japanese armor becomes scarcer, losses, maintenance failures, and supply disruptions reduce available vehicles. The threat that justified Boys' rifle issue in 1941 diminishes. But the rifles remain in inventory, still capable, still occasionally employed, maintained by the logistical momentum of 3 years' service. The weapon designed to counter 1930s light tanks continues killing 1930s light tanks in 1944. It is an odd synchronicity. British equipment written off after facing 1940 German armor remains effective against 1944 Japanese armor. The difference is not British competence or Japanese weakness. It is simply that Japanese armor design in the Pacific theater never evolved beyond the capability envelope the Boys' rifle was designed to defeat. Obsolescence, it turns out, is context-dependent. Burma, China, and the Pacific 1945. The Boys' anti-tank rifle enters its final year of combat service. By early 1945, British forces in Burma conducted offensive operations driving toward Rangoon. Chinese forces in Yunnan and Burma advance against Japanese defensive positions. American forces island hop across the Pacific. In all these theaters, scattered Boys' rifles remain in service. The weapons role continues to contract. Newer anti-tank weapons, PIAT, American bazooka, British projector infantry anti-tank, offer superior performance. These weapons fire hollow-charge projectiles that defeat armor through chemical energy rather than kinetic penetration. A PIAT round can penetrate 100 millimeters of armor, far exceeding the Boys' rifle's capability. The logistics are simpler. PIAT ammunition is lighter and more compact than 55 Boys cartridges. Yet some units retain their Boys rifles. The reason is capability overlap. A PIAT is excellent against armor at short range, under 100 yards, but ineffective beyond that distance. A Boys rifle remains accurate and effective at 200 to 300 yards. For engaging light vehicles, bunkers, or distant targets, the rifle offers utility the PIAT cannot match. Australian forces in Borneo and New Guinea maintain Boys rifles in inventory through Japanese surrender. The weapons serve primarily as heavy precision rifles, long-range sniping against structures, vehicles, or prepared positions. Anti-armor employment is rare. Japanese armor in these theaters is almost non-existent by 1945. But the rifles remain useful enough to justify the logistical burden of maintaining ammunition stocks. British 14th Army's advance to Rangoon in April-May 1945 includes units still carrying Boys rifles. The weapons see occasional employment against Japanese Type 95 and Chiha tanks during rearguard actions. But most engagements involve the rifles used against softer targets, trucks, bunkers, supply points. The rifle's power and range make it valuable even absent armored threats. Chinese forces in Burma employ Boys rifles provided through British Lend-Lease. These weapons supplement Chinese anti-tank capabilities, which remain limited throughout the war. Against Japanese light armor and fortifications, the Boys rifles perform adequately. Chinese troops appreciate the weapon's mechanical reliability. It requires minimal maintenance compared to more complex systems, and accept the weight and recoil as necessary compromises. Ammunition production winds down. British factories ceased manufacturing 55 Boys cartridges in late 1944, judging existing stock sufficient to support operations through war's end. Indian ordnance facilities continue limited production through early 1945, then stop. The cartridge is not obsolete, rifles remain in service, but priority shifts to other munitions. Existing stocks, distributed across Southeast Asia Command's depots, total several 100,000 rounds. Adequate for continued employment at reduced scales through war's end. Japanese armor in 1945 is effectively defeated. Losses, mechanical attrition, and fuel shortages reduce available vehicles to scattered survivors. Japanese forces in Burma, isolated and retreating, abandon most mechanized equipment. The threat the boy's rifle was redeployed to counter in 1941 no longer exists in significant strength. The rifle has, in a sense, outlasted its enemy. Post-war planning begins before Japanese surrender. British Army staff officers review equipment requirements for occupation duties and potential future conflicts. The boy's rifle does not appear on retention lists. The weapon is too specialized, too heavy, and comprehensively superseded by newer designs. Plans call for consolidating remaining boys' rifles into storage, retaining minimal quantities for training or ceremonial purposes, and scrapping the majority. VJ Day, August 15, 1945. British and Commonwealth forces in Southeast Asia transition from combat to occupation. Boys' rifles are withdrawn from active service, collected at ordnance depots, and either scrapped or placed in long-term storage. Some weapons are transferred to local forces, Indian Army, Burmese military, other regional forces as military aid. Others are shipped to museums or retained as training aids. The weapon that Britain tried to discard after France, that found unexpected effectiveness in the Pacific, that killed tanks for 4 years across Malaya, Burma, and the Southwest Pacific, passes into history. Total combat employment. Approximately 4 years, from December 1941 through August 1945. Theaters: Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, Burma, India, New Guinea, Solomons, China. Confirmed kills. Impossible to precisely quantify, but multiple dozens of Japanese armored vehicles across all theaters. The rifle story illustrates a fundamental principle of military equipment. Effectiveness depends on context. A weapon inadequate in one theater may excel in another. Obsolescence is not absolute, it is relative to the threat. The boy's rifle was obsolete facing German panzers in France. It was adequate, sometimes excellent, facing Japanese light tanks in the Pacific. The difference was not the rifle. The difference was the enemy's armor. The numbers tell the story with precision that narratives cannot match. Between 1937 and 1943, British factories manufactured approximately 62,000 boys' anti-tank rifles. Of these, roughly 5,000 deployed to the Middle East, 10,000 to the Far East, and the remainder distributed between home forces, training establishments, and Commonwealth forces. Far East allocation, 10,000 rifles, supported forces across multiple commands. Malaya Command received approximately 1,500 rifles before December 1941. Hong Kong Garrison held roughly 200. Burma Command received approximately 800. India maintained stocks of several thousand for training and reserve. Australian and New Zealand forces in the Pacific received approximately 1,000 rifles through 1942. Ammunition production totaled approximately 12 million rounds between 1937 and 1945. Of this total, roughly 2 million rounds deployed to the Far East. Consumption rates varied by theater and intensity of operations. Malaya Campaign, December 1941 through February 1942. Approximately 50,000 rounds expended. Burma Campaign, 1942 through 1945. Approximately 300,000 rounds. Pacific Campaigns. Estimated 200,000 rounds. Combat effectiveness requires comparative analysis. In France, May-June 1940, boys' rifles engaged primarily Panzer II, III, and IV vehicles. Armor thickness: 25 to 50 mm frontal protection. Boys' rifle penetration: 21 to 23 mm under optimal conditions. Result: minimal effectiveness, high failure rate, negligible impact on German operations. In Malaya and Burma, December 1941 through 1945, boys' rifles engaged primarily Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Chiha vehicles. Armor thickness: 12 to 25 mm with most vehicles at lower end. Boys' rifle penetration: 21 to 23 mm unchanged. Result: High effectiveness, reliable penetration at typical engagement ranges, significant impact on Japanese armored operations. The arithmetic is simple. A rifle that penetrates 21 mm fails against 30 mm armor but succeeds against 12 mm armor. Context determines capability. Casualty statistics quantify the rifle's impact. Japanese armor losses in Malaya, December 1941 through February 1942. Approximately 40 to 50 vehicles total from all causes. Boys' rifle attribution. Estimated 10 to 15 vehicles, roughly 20 to 30% of total losses. Burma Campaign, 1942 through 1945. Japanese armor losses approximately 100 vehicles from all causes. Boys' rifle attribution. Estimated 20 to 30 vehicles, 20 to 30%. These percentages matter. In theaters where anti-tank gun deployment was limited, the boys' rifle provided the majority of infantry-level anti-armor capability. Without these weapons, British and Commonwealth forces would have faced Japanese armor with only grenades, mines, and improvised charges, far less effective alternatives. Cost-effectiveness analysis reveals unexpected value. Production cost per boys' rifle. Approximately 30 British pounds. 1940 values. Ammunition cost. Approximately 2 shillings per round. Cost to disable one Japanese Hago using boys' rifle fire. Approximately 10 to 20 rounds average, or 1 to 2 pounds ammunition cost. By comparison, a 2-pounder anti-tank gun cost approximately 200 pounds, required a dedicated crew and towing vehicle, and consumed significantly more expensive ammunition. The boys' rifle, measured by cost per kill against light armor, was among the most economical anti-tank weapons employed by British forces in the Pacific Theater. This economic efficiency did not make the rifle ideal. It remained heavy, awkward, and limited in capability. But in a theater where resources were constrained and light armor was the primary threat, economic efficiency mattered. Logistical statistics underscore the rifle's sustainability. Maintenance requirements. Moderate with battalion-level armorers capable of most repairs. Parts commonality. Minimal. The boys' rifle shared few components with other weapons, requiring dedicated spare part stock. Ammunition weight. Approximately 0.85 pounds per round, or 4.25 pounds per 5-round magazine. A soldier could practically carry 2 magazines, 10 rounds, in addition to personal equipment. Resupply burden was significant but manageable. Comparative analysis with other anti-tank rifles. German Panzerbuchs 39, 7.92 mm, penetration approximately 13 mm, Soviet PTRD and PTRS, 14.5 mm, penetration approximately 25 mm, Japanese Type 97 20 mm, penetration approximately 30 mm. The boys' rifle fell mid-range, less powerful than Soviet or Japanese designs, more powerful than German. Against the specific threats in Southeast Asia, this mid-range capability was sufficient. Service longevity. 8 years from initial production, 1937, to end of combat service, 1945. Most weapons deployed to the Far East saw 3 to 4 years of active service, far exceeding the typical lifespan of equipment in tropical combat conditions. This longevity reflects both mechanical reliability and sustained logistical support. Final disposition. Post-war, approximately 40,000 boys' rifles were scrapped, 10,000 entered long-term storage, 5,000 transferred to Allied forces, and the remainder retained for training or ceremonial purposes. By 1950, fewer than 1,000 remained in active British service, primarily as drill weapons. By 1960, virtually none remained in any military inventory. The numbers confirm the narrative. A weapon inadequate in Europe proved adequate, sometimes excellent, in the Pacific. Not through any change in the weapon, but through change in context. The enemy's armor, not the rifle's capability, determined effectiveness. Statistics cannot capture human experience. The weight on a soldier's shoulder, the recoil slamming into flesh, the satisfaction of watching an enemy tank shudder to a halt. But numbers can confirm what experience suggested. The boys' rifle, judged obsolete by European standards, was exactly adequate by Pacific standards. and adequacy in war is often enough. Britain, 1946 through present. At the Imperial War Museum in London, a boy's anti-tank rifle rests in a display case alongside other British infantry weapons of the Second World War. The placard notes the weapon's specifications, service history, and tactical employment. Museum visitors, if they pause to read, learn that this rifle served in multiple theaters, achieved greatest success in the Pacific, and was withdrawn from service shortly after war's end. The rifle in the case is serial number BR51238, manufactured at Enfield in 1939. Its service record, preserved in museum archives, shows deployment to Malaya in 1941, capture at Singapore in February 1942, recovery in 1945, and eventual transfer to the museum in 1949. The weapon shows were consistent with combat service. Scratched barrel, dented stock, worn bipod joints. These scars tell stories the placard cannot fully capture. Similar rifles occupy displays at other museums. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra holds multiple boys' rifles with documented service in New Guinea and the Solomons. The Royal Armouries in Leeds maintains a collection including early prototypes and production variants. The National Museum of Singapore displays a rifle recovered from Bukit Timah battlefield. Each museum interprets the weapon differently, but all acknowledge its unexpected effectiveness in Pacific service. Post-war historical assessment evolved gradually. Initial British official histories, published in the 1950s, gave the boys' rifle minimal attention. The weapon was considered a minor element in larger campaigns, interesting primarily as an example of obsolete equipment retained for lack of alternatives. Malaya and Burma campaign volumes mention the rifles in passing, noting their presence but not analyzing their impact. Academic reassessment began in the 1970s and 80s. Military historians examining Japanese records and British battalion war diaries identified patterns of boys' rifle effectiveness previously overlooked. The weapon's role in disrupting Japanese armored operations received serious analysis. Researchers quantified kills, assessed tactical impact, and concluded that the rifle made significant contributions despite its obsolete reputation. Japanese perspectives, available after post-war documentation became accessible, confirmed British assessments. Japanese armor officers interviewed in the 1960s and 70s recalled the boys' rifle as a serious threat. Tank crew training in 1942 and beyond specifically addressed the danger of British anti-tank rifles. The weapon Britain dismissed as inadequate received respectful treatment from its opponents. Modern assessment recognizes the boys' rifle as a case study in context-dependent effectiveness. Military historians use the weapon to illustrate how equipment performance depends on threat characteristics. Engineering students analyze the rifle's ballistics and armor penetration mechanics. The weapon appears in textbooks as an example of specialized equipment finding unexpected utility when redeployed to appropriate contexts. Veterans' memoirs provide human perspective. British, Indian, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers who carried the rifle offer varied assessments. Some remember the weapon fondly, heavy but effective, capable of killing tanks when properly employed. Others recall frustration, awkward to carry, brutal recoil, limited tactical flexibility. All acknowledge that the rifle worked when it needed to work. One particularly detailed memoir, published in 1978, comes from a former lance corporal of the 2nd 15th Punjab Regiment who served at Jitra in December 1941. He describes firing the first shot of his section's engagement with Japanese armor. A flank shot at approximately 150 yards that penetrated Hago's side armor and killed the crew commander. He carried the memory of that shot, the rifle's brutal recoil, the visible impact, the tank's sudden halt, for nearly 40 years before writing it down. His account, now archived at the Imperial War Museum, provides ground-level confirmation of what statistics can only suggest. Collectors and enthusiasts maintain interest in the boys' rifle. Surviving examples, demilitarized and transferred to civilian ownership, appear occasionally at auctions and military shows. Prices reflect rarity and historical interest. The rifle is not a forgotten weapon, though it never achieved the iconic status of contemporary small arms like the Lee Enfield rifle or Bren gun. Technical documentation remains accessible. Original design drawings, ballistic test reports, and production records are preserved at various archives. Researchers can reconstruct the rifle's development, analyze design choices, and understand the engineering compromises that shaped the final product. The weapon is well documented, perhaps better documented than its marginal historical importance might justify. Educational programs occasionally feature the boy's rifle. Military museums offer hands-on demonstrations, allowing visitors to handle deactivated examples and appreciate the weapon's weight and size. These programs emphasize the rifle's historical context, the strategic situation that drove its development, the tactical realities that shaped its employment, and the operational results that defined its legacy. The rifle's story offers lessons that extend beyond narrow technical history. It demonstrates that obsolescence is not absolute, that context determines capability, and that discarded equipment may retain value under different circumstances. These lessons remain relevant to contemporary military planning, equipment acquisition, and force structure decisions. At the Imperial War Museum, visitors still pause before the display case holding serial number BR51238. Some read the placard carefully, absorbing facts and figures. Others glance briefly and move on. A few veterans, historians, or simply those with curiosity about forgotten weapons linger longer, perhaps imagining what it meant to carry this 36-pound rifle through Malayan jungles or Burmese hills, to hear enemy tanks approaching, to settle into position and wait for the perfect flank shot. The rifle, silent in its case, offers no answers. But it testifies to a truth that warfare constantly reaffirms. Effectiveness is contextual, obsolescence is relative, and equipment discarded in one theater may prove indispensable in another. The boy's rifle failed in Europe. It succeeded in the Pacific. The difference was not the weapon. The difference was the war. The boy's anti-tank rifle disappeared from active service in 1945. The weapon, the tactics it enabled, and the specific threats it countered all passed into history. Yet the rifle's story offers insights that transcend its narrow technical specifications and limited service life. First lesson: design context matters profoundly. The boy's rifle was engineered to defeat 1930s light tanks, vehicles with 10 to 16 millimeters of armor, modest firepower, and limited mobility by later standards. The weapon met this design requirement successfully. What doomed the rifle in Europe was not design failure but context change. Tank armor thickened faster than rifle capabilities could advance. The boy's became obsolete not because it failed, but because the threat evolved beyond its envelope. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Equipment designed for one threat environment proves inadequate when that environment shifts. The lesson is not to avoid specialized equipment. Specialization often yields superior performance, but to recognize that specialized equipment loses value when context changes. The military organization that can quickly identify context changes and redirect specialized equipment to appropriate new roles gains significant advantage. Second lesson: logistics determine capability as much as technology. The boy's rifle remained effective in the Pacific partly because Southeast Asia Command maintained ammunition production, spare parts stocks, and repair facilities. Had British logistics failed to support the weapon, had ammunition run short, or replacement parts become unavailable, the rifle's technical adequacy would have been irrelevant. Conversely, the best anti-tank weapons in the world achieve nothing if they cannot be supplied, maintained, and employed sustainably. Modern military planning often emphasizes technological superiority while undervaluing logistical sustainability. The boy's rifle's Pacific service suggests this emphasis is misplaced. A technically inferior weapon that can be sustained in theater may outperform a superior weapon that cannot. Logistics is not the unglamorous support function for combat operations, it is the foundation that enables all combat operations. Third lesson: tactical adaptation extends equipment utility beyond original design intent. Australian employment of the boy's rifle as a multi-role heavy rifle, engaging bunkers, barges, vehicles, and structures, demonstrated creative tactical adaptation. The weapon's designers never envisioned these applications, but soldiers in theater identified opportunities and exploited them. This adaptation required combined arms thinking, willingness to experiment, and acceptance of non-doctrinal employment. Military organizations often resist such adaptation, preferring doctrinal purity to tactical flexibility. The resistance is understandable. Doctrine exists to standardize training, simplify logistics, and ensure interoperability. But rigid adherence to doctrine can prevent effective exploitation of available equipment. Organizations that encourage tactical experimentation within disciplined frameworks gain adaptability that pure doctrinal approaches cannot match. Fourth lesson: enemy capabilities determine defensive requirements, not abstract technical specifications. The Boy's rifle was inadequate in Europe because German tanks carried 30 to 50 millimeters of frontal armor. The same rifle was adequate in the Pacific because Japanese tanks carried 12 to 14 millimeters. No change in British rifle design occurred, the change was in enemy protection levels. This suggests that defensive equipment should be sized to actual threats, not theoretical maximums. Contemporary military planning often demands equipment capable of defeating worst-case threats, even when such threats are unlikely to be encountered. This approach drives costs and complexity while potentially reducing sustainability. An alternative approach, accepting capability matched to likely threats, while maintaining flexibility to upscale if threats materialize, might yield better overall force capability within constrained budgets. Fifth lesson: small unit weapons matter in ways strategic analysis often overlooks. The Boy's rifle never decided campaigns or determined strategic outcomes. Japanese forces defeated British defenders in Malaya and Burma despite Boy's rifle effectiveness. But at platoon and company level, the rifle made tangible differences: disabled tanks, disrupted attacks, protected flanks. These small unit effects accumulated across hundreds of engagements, shaping tactical outcomes even if not determining strategic results. Modern analysis sometimes focuses exclusively on strategic-level capabilities, air power, naval forces, long-range precision strike, while undervaluing infantry weapons. The Boy's rifle story suggests this focus may miss important dynamics. Wars are ultimately decided by small units holding or taking ground. Equipment that helps those small units succeed deserves more attention than strategic-level analysis typically provides. Sixth lesson: institutional memory affects equipment decisions. The Boy's rifle was written off after France, then rediscovered as useful in the Pacific. This cycle, discard, then rediscover, suggests inadequate institutional memory. Had British planners in 1940 recognized that the rifle might retain utility against lighter armor in other theaters, they could have planned redeployment rather than hastily improvising it after war began. Contemporary military organizations face similar challenges. Equipment deemed obsolete in current conflicts may retain utility in future conflicts with different characteristics. Maintaining institutional memory about equipment capabilities, limitations, and potential alternative applications enables better decision-making when contexts shift. Final lesson: effectiveness is contextual, not absolute. The Boy's rifle was not inherently good or bad. It was effective against certain threats under certain conditions, and ineffective against others. This contextual nature of effectiveness applies to all military equipment. Organizations that recognize this, that assess equipment relative to specific threats rather than seeking universal capabilities, make better acquisition and employment decisions. The Boy's anti-tank rifle served from 1937 through 1945. It failed in its primary intended theater, succeeded in a secondary theater, and vanished into history once its moment passed. The weapon was never revolutionary, never decisive, never iconic. It was simply adequate when adequacy was needed, employed by soldiers who made it work in contexts its designers never imagined. That adequacy deserves recognition, not celebration. The rifle was neither elegant nor particularly innovative, but acknowledgement. In the complexity of industrial warfare, where strategic brilliance and tactical excellence receive most attention, there is merit in recognizing the unglamorous adequacy of functional equipment employed competently by professional soldiers. The Boy's rifle did its job when asked. That is a sufficient legacy for any weapon. The story of the Boy's anti-tank rifle spans 8 years, multiple theaters, and thousands of individual engagements. From Enfield testing ranges in 1937 to Burmese jungles in 1945, the weapon journeyed through contexts that determined its utility and effectiveness. Written off as obsolete after France, rediscovered as adequate in Malaya, sustained through 4 years of Pacific warfare, and finally retired once its moment passed. The rifle's trajectory illustrates fundamental truths about military equipment, institutional adaptation, and the relationship between technical capability and tactical context. The weapon itself was unremarkable. 36 pounds of steel, wood, and mechanical complexity, firing a 14mm projectile at modest velocity. No technological breakthrough, no revolutionary innovation, just competent engineering applied to a specific problem. That the rifle succeeded in unexpected contexts reflects not brilliant design but appropriate matching of capability to threat. The soldiers who carried the weapon deserve final recognition. British, Indian, Australian, New Zealand, Chinese, and Burmese troops hauled 36 pounds of anti-tank rifle through jungles, over mountains, and across battlefields. They absorbed brutal recoil, managed complex manual of arms, and maintained the weapons under difficult conditions. When the moment came, enemy tanks approaching, ranges closing, the decision to fire or withdraw, they made the shot. Their competence, more than any inherent weapon quality, determined effectiveness. The boys' anti-tank rifle killed tanks. Not all tanks, not even most tanks, but enough tanks in enough engagements to matter at tactical level. That suffices as a historical verdict. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.